Hello there, Paul Haswell here. How are you doing? I thought I'd take a break, and I've been doing podcasts because I've been stuck at home for pretty much 2 weeks now, unable to go out. And I thought it might be nice to actually see my face. Maybe not. See how you feel about that, rather than just hear my voice for a change. Now you can tell I'm at home. I'm not in Pinsent Mason's office. If you didn't know already, you can probably tell that I'm a bit of a record collector, which is basically one of the limitations of physical media in Hong Kong is that we have a limited amount of space, and you can only see within the frame. I could turn the camera, but I won't. You would be horrified. But this entire room, which is my living room, is made up of records. So someone did say after one of my podcasts when I did a video of my study, where are all the records? They are in here. And to an extent, physical media is one of the things that I want to discuss as part of this week's topic. So I'm going to talk about providing things as a service. I was going to call it software as a service, or SaaS, which when I was a very junior lawyer was all the rage. Everyone was so excited about software as a service as this new big thing. In some ways, I suppose it was the precursor to the cloud technology that we all rely on, particularly at the moment. But it was a lot of SaaS contracts were essentially a new form of outsourcing, where rather than having basically buying software in and having it for a limited license period, you essentially outsourced to a service provider who's providing software that would be coming through a thin client. You just have a desktop or a browser. In some cases, you have specific consoles just to use the software, which is hardware and software and a service. So it's a bit complicated. But before I go into it, let's go back. Back in the day when you would buy software, or indeed any service, let's use records as an example. If you buy music, you would buy it on some sort of physical media. You may have a license to enjoy it. Certainly you would have a license if you were buying a record, and that you weren't supposed to reproduce it without the copyright owner's consent, even though those license terms were not something you would click. It was often governed by the law itself. But you'd have a product that would be a fixed cost, and you'd have that product for as long as you needed it, or until it became essentially obsolete, till a new version came out. Good example, and probably the most obvious example, are operating systems for laptops, PCs, or software such as Office. If you're in the creative space, Adobe's suite things, the most obvious thing would obviously be Photoshop. You would buy it, you would have it, and that was it. And the same was very much true in the corporate and enterprise world. You would often buy a software solution, you would have that solution, you would probably have something extra for updates and patches within the agreement, but it was almost bought as an asset. It was, I suppose, a capital expenditure, a capex, a piece of capex rather than opex, operating expenditure. Again, bear with me with that. But then around really the 2000s, things changed. People realised both advantages and disadvantages of, rather than offering software as a one-off purchase, as boxed software essentially, even though it often didn't come in a box, there was more money to be made, and in some cases more advantages for both the purchaser and the person selling it, the seller, to actually sell this product as something that was a service that was often updated, and you'd pay a subscription fee. And we saw this happen quite early on in the corporate outsourcing world. So rather than just buying some software package, vendors would, and the most obvious ones are things like Oracle and SAP, you would essentially be buying software as a service. You would pay every month or every year, you would have a certain number of licenses to use whatever they're offering, and it would be a thing that would go on year from year. Within that agreement, you had various things such as SLAs, service level agreement, which would say what sort of service you should be getting and what would happen if something went wrong. So if, for example, the software stops working, and it's payroll software, which is an example, and you can't pay your staff, you would have a period by which you should get a response, and the whole thing should be fixed. Hopefully it would be fairly quick, 24 hours. Sometimes now you see things, certainly in terms of security software, responses within minutes, which is something quite exciting. I recently managed to get someone down to a 4 hours from a 24-hour response period, which I was quite proud of, but there we go. And it was accepted very much in the corporate space. It's very unusual now, unless you're dealing with a very small organization, to see people who are literally just buying software, and that software, they have it, they own it, or at least they own the license to it, and that license expires. Now it'll be a license that renews from year to year, and they pay every year, and it's a subscription model. Now, nothing particularly exciting there. And let's be honest, SaaS outsourcing is not the sexiest thing it was. However, it laid the ground for what we now see as cloud computing, where most of us now think about how much software are you actually using both in your corporate space in work or at home that actually you feel like you own it, like you've paid for it once and then you've got it forever. Back in the day, Photoshop, you'd pay for it once, you'd have it forever. Now you're probably using Adobe's Creative Cloud, whereby you're paying a subscription fee. And for someone like me who's not a heavy user of Photoshop, it's quite frustrating to watch it go out of your account every month, that you think, why am I always paying for this? But I bet very few pieces of software are actually ones that you just have, unless it's something that's old and legacy. And we've seen this now encroach into all aspects of our lives. So it's not just the software you have on your computer. You may find the software on your TV, if you have a smart TV, is something that needs to be updated, though you won't pay for it all the time. But other things, if it's things like Netflix, so the software itself on your TV there, but if you're subscribing to something like Netflix, if you're subscribing to something like Spotify, if you're subscribed to iCloud, to Dropbox, to Office 365, you find that suddenly everything around us is, I won't call it software as a service, because now a lot more of it is more than services, even though the root of it is software service, but it's something as a service. Now, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? If you are stuck at home right now and you're reliant entirely on your Netflix, Disney Plus, whatever subscription, then surely it's a good thing. Thank goodness that you actually have a way that you can watch whatever you want at any time and you don't have a house full of physical objects. Yeah, maybe I should think carefully about what I'm saying there. If you have Spotify, you can listen to any track at any time you want. If you're using Creative Cloud, which I mentioned by Adobe, your photographs should, in theory, be in the cloud. You're paying monthly for them, but you don't have to have a massive hard drive at home. And everything's fine as long as the cloud, as long as your internet connection does not go down. And generally, touch wood, because all of us are relying so much on it at the moment, it doesn't. Similarly, if you were a video gamer, if you play games, you had something like, let's see, I've got one here. If you had a Nintendo Switch right now, very different than if you had a Super Nintendo where you'd buy a cartridge, that would be it. Most of the software on here, even if you buy a physical format, will have updates. You're not necessarily paying every month for it, although if you've got a subscription to, I think it's a Nintendo Switch Online or something like that, then you would be paying. That's for online gaming only. But still, it's very much a service which is updated all the time. Now, this is great, but let's go back to the record and pull something out, hopefully something that's not too embarrassing. Here you go, Sigur Rós. A bit of street cred having a Sigur Rós record, which is embarrassing. I haven't opened and was bought at the sadly defunct Hong Kong Records, but there we go. But if you buy something like this, I can listen to this forever. As long as I've got the equipment and there's a turntable over there, I can listen to this record no matter what. It will never expire. If I don't pay a subscription fee, I don't lose access to it. If for some reason Sigur Rós or the label, which is XL Recordings, decide that they don't want anyone to listen to it anymore, tough. I've got the record. I can do absolutely whatever I want to it. If I wanted to, they'd probably be breaking the law. I could record it to another format, but it is mine to use. It's a physical thing because it's not being offered to me as a service. It is a product. Now, with things that are offered as a service, the issue is that you don't own them. You don't own the right to use them. You don't use the right to really access them. And depending on your agreement with the provider, you may or may not be able to have that right taken away from you. And this is the crux of it. So back in the day of software as a service agreements, and even now to some extent in the corporate space, there'd be a long negotiation as to what happens if that right to use something is taken away. How can it be taken away? What are the exit provisions? What sort of handover do you have to have? And you spend hours negotiating this, if not days, with good cause, because you want to be sure. For example, I used payroll as an example earlier. You want to be able to get that data out of that system, own it yourself, put it into another system. The data should be owned by you. But what we've seen with the rise of the consumer as a service products, particularly again in the gaming world, in the music world, and I think now we're seeing it in the streaming media world as well, is that people can't negotiate the terms and conditions. So if you stop using Spotify, you essentially lose the right to listen to anything on there. You go back to the free service, I suppose. Similarly, if you stop your subscription to Switch Online, you can't play online anymore. And I think you lose your save games if you stored them in the cloud as well. They don't quote me on that. If you cease your subscription to Netflix, then it's gone. You also, if some content is removed that you need, you don't really have much recompense. Have you even read, think about this, have you read the terms and conditions to any of the subscriptions that you've signed up to? Well, I assume, even if you're a lawyer, you probably haven't. Some of them are so lengthy you may as well be a lawyer, you'd probably be qualified by the time you've read them all. But you don't realise that content can be removed at will. We've seen it with albums. Taylor Swift removed her albums from Spotify for a while. We've seen it with video games that are no longer available due to a licensing issue. They suddenly disappear off a service. We've even seen it with books. Amazon, with their Kindle, famously withdrew a copy of 1984 by George Orwell, how ironic, from a user's Kindle because they didn't have the rights to sell it anymore. Bit of a problem there, but they had the ability to do that. And I'm seeing, which is quite a worry, is that as people get used in the consumer space to accepting something as a service and accepting that they almost have to take it as is, they're not negotiating them in the corporate world the same way either. So when someone buying something as a service, unless it's an absolutely critical service that goes to the very crux of their business, they're not really thinking, well, do I need to actually argue about what happens if this terminates? What is the right to terminate? How do I get my data out? What if I don't have access? I'm now seeing increasingly deals where people are getting into basically offering something as a service and not even questioning the SLAs that are provided. The most recent one, which I mentioned earlier, was a 24-hour notification within the provider becoming aware of a data breach in a data center agreement. Now that 24 hours, in some countries, that puts you massively on the back foot. Think of that in the context of the GDPR, where you have limited time to respond. If you only hear after the provider has heard 24 hours later, what do you do? And how is the provider, I mean, this is when the provider becomes aware, how is the provider going to sit on that and wait and think, who do we notify? It's a worry. So my takeaway for today is things as a service are great. And again, I have no space for any more records. They're great in the corporate space, and although they can end up costing more depending on the pricing models, the subscription allows you to add and remove users, licenses. You get a bit more freedom, and let's face it, a lot more convenience. The whole software as a service thing has made it a lot easier for everyone to work from home. By the way, incidentally, how many of you have read the Zoom terms and conditions? There's a service that a lot of people are using. I bet very few people have read whether there's actual decent encryption in place, they're using it for sensitive work topics, or how secure it actually is. Maybe go and read those after you've watched this. But yeah, it's a very convenient thing, but you can't become complacent. You have to remember that something that's offered as a service, you don't own it, and you don't necessarily have any control unless the license agreement that says what control you have sets out what you can and can't do. So be careful. Make sure that you're reading carefully everything you sign up to, and don't be too keen to rely on services without really checking them out. There's a lot of new things springing up, particularly at the moment for home users. Certainly in the corporate space, people do buy into new services without really checking how they get out of it, and then they get into a real mess. Particularly, for example, we're finding certainly at the moment, some of these providers face financial difficulty. They may fold. What happens to your data? Have you checked what will happen to your data, to whatever service you have, if it's particularly if it's critical, if suddenly it's not provided? But anyway, good to speak to you all. I hope you are staying safe during these troubled times. I hope you are not horribly bored at home. There are plenty of things to do, plenty of things to watch, and plenty of interesting ways to spend your time. You could get into collecting records, for example, although then you would have to go out to a record shop. One of the horrors I've found is that record deliveries to Hong Kong have pretty much been suspended, so I'm having to go to my local friendly record shop to sort myself out. Not that I need to feed the habit. Anyway, I'll be back again very soon, most likely with a podcast, but we'll see. This was quite easy to set up. It depends how much people like looking at records and my face rather than just hearing my voice. But in the meantime, stay safe, and hopefully this whole horrible thing will pass and we'll come out of it all knowing how important our software services and all of the things we take for granted at the moment really are. Take care, everyone.